The first sound of that morning wasn't the birds. It wasn't the wind rustling through the trees. It was a rumble of bulldozers echoing across the hills of Maple Hollow. For nearly a century, those hills had known nothing but peace. Quiet days, church bells, and the slow rhythm of small-town life. But on this morning, the peace was broken. A wall of dust rolled over the ridge, swallowing the sunlight, choking the air. The ground trembled as heavy machines crawled toward the old Harris family property, land that had belonged to one family for 5 generations. At the edge of that land stood a man, still, unmoving. His name was Jacob Harris. 38 years old, born and raised in Maple Hollow. He stood there with a folded flag in his hands, the same flag that had been draped over his grandfather's coffin 40 years earlier. Behind him was a small fenced patch of earth, barely an acre. The wooden posts leaned with age, and wild grass had crept over the stones. Some of the markers were nothing more than names carved into rock, weathered by time and rain. But to Jacob, that land wasn't forgotten. It was sacred. It was where his great-grandfather, Captain Eli Harris, was buried, a World War II veteran, a man whose photo still hung in the town's courthouse. It was where generations of the Harris family had been laid to rest, farmers, soldiers, mothers, sons. And now, men in hard hats and neon vests were about to turn it into a parking lot for a luxury golf resort. The new developer, a slick, suited man from the city, had called it progress. But Jacob called it erasure. The family had been fighting the sale for months. Petitions, court hearings, appeals. But the paperwork went through anyway, a loophole buried deep in county zoning law. And so that morning, as the machines roared closer, Jacob stood at the fence, alone, watching decades of family history vanish under the shadow of a bulldozer. The foreman yelled from behind his sunglasses, "Sir, you need to move off this property. We have orders to clear this section today." Jacob didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even look at him. He just said quietly, "My grandfather's buried here, and if you're going to tear it down, you'll have to start with me." The man scoffed, rolled his eyes, and signaled for the machines to keep moving. That's when the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest sound from down the valley. Church bells. One, then another, then more. The sound spread, echoing across Maple Hollow. Doors began to open. Curtains drew back. And people, old neighbors, farmers, veterans, started walking down the dirt road, one by one. Some carried flags. Some carried old photos. And a few, the ones who had known Captain Eli Harris personally, carried something else. His uniform. Olive green jackets. Dusty caps. Medals still pinned to the chest. Within the hour, that quiet hill was filled, not with bulldozers and noise, but with people, dozens at first, then hundreds, men who had served, women whose fathers had fought beside him, kids who had grown up hearing the stories. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a human wall between the machines and the graves. And as the sun climbed higher over Maple Hollow, one thing became crystal clear. The developers might have owned the land on paper, but they didn't own its soul, because that little cemetery, those weathered stones, those names, meant something the world had forgotten how to measure: honor, sacrifice, legacy. And before that day was over, the entire town will remind the world that some things cannot be bulldozed. His name was Eli Turner, 42 years old, a quiet mechanic who worked out a small tin-roof garage on the edge of Maple Hollow, Georgia. The kind of man who didn't say much but was known by everyone. He fixed tractors, church vans, even the sheriff's old patrol car. If it had an engine, Eli could make it breathe again. But what really defined him wasn't his work. It was his land. The Turner family had lived on that soil for over a century, long before the town had traffic lights or golf courses or tourists. It was his grandfather, Sergeant Amos Turner, who had made it sacred. Amos wasn't just a farmer. He was a hero, a decorated World War II veteran who had fought in Europe, seen the worst of humanity, and returned home with one dream: to build a place where the fallen could rest together, no matter their color, rank, or background. See, back then, even cemeteries were segregated. But Amos, he didn't care what the law said. He cared what was right. So he cleared a patch of his 40 acres by hand and built a small white chapel with a bell that still rang every Sunday. Beside it, he fenced off a hill and began laying to men who never made a home. White crosses and black marble stones stood side by side. In Maple Hollow, that was unheard of. And yet, that little cemetery became something more than just family ground. It became a symbol. People from across the county came to lay wreaths there every Memorial Day. Local school teachers brought students to learn about the war, not from textbooks, but from stories etched in stone. Old veterans came to sit on the benches Amos had built, staring at the flags waving in the Georgia breeze. Time passed. Seasons changed. The oaks grew taller, the grass greener, and the sound of the chapel bell became a Sunday tradition. But nothing lasts forever. When Amos passed away, Eli, barely in his 20s then, promised his grandfather two things: to keep the land and the family, and to never let anyone forget the men buried beneath it. And for 20 years, he kept that promise. Every spring, he trimmed the hedges by hand. Every summer, he repainted the gate white. Every winter, he replaced the worn flag that flew over the graves, red, white, and blue, just like Amos wanted. To Eli, that land wasn't just a field. It was memory made real. It was sacred ground. But the town of Maple Hollow, it changed. What used to be wide-open farmland slowly turned into gated neighborhoods and shopping centers. Developers started showing up, slick men in shiny shoes, talking about urban expansion, community growth, and revitalization. The locals called it progress. Eli called it greed in a suit. It started small, 1 acre here, another there. Then came the big signs. Coming soon, Harbor Ridge Resort and Estates. They built a golf course where the old orchard used to be. They paved over the Turner Creek, the same creek where Eli learned to fish with his dad. And before long, all that was left untouched was that small, quiet cemetery on the hill. Then one morning, a white envelope showed up in his mailbox. Thick paper, corporate seal. He opened it slowly, grease still on his hands from fixing a client's pickup. Inside were a few neatly typed paragraphs and a single sentence that made his heart stop. This property is zoned for acquisition under the Urban Expansion Initiative. The cemetery will be relocated at the owner's expense. Relocated, as if the resting souls of his ancestors, the men who had fought, bled, and died for the country, were just names on stones to be moved like garden decorations. Eli stood there on his porch for a long time, letter in hand, wind tugging at the corners of the page. He looked up at the hill, the one where the chapel still stood, paint peeling but strong. And in that moment, something in him hardened. This wasn't about land anymore. It wasn't even about money. It was about respect, the same respect his grandfather fought for when he built that cemetery. Eli folded the letter, placed it beside the folded flag in his living room, and whispered, "Not while I'm still breathing." When the sun rose the next morning, Eli Turner wasn't under the hood of a truck like usual. He was behind the wheel of his old Ford pickup, driving straight into the heart of town, straight to the Maple County Zoning Office. The letter lay on the passenger seat, creased and smudged with grease. He'd read it a dozen times since dawn, and each time it hit harder. They weren't asking. They were telling. The county building sat on Main Street, a blocky brick structure with an American flag out front that seemed to wave more for show than pride. Inside, it smelled like floor wax and coffee gone stale. Behind a polished oak counter sat Mr. Douglas Dillard, the county zoning director. His hair was slicked back like it had been painted in place. His tie screamed money. His cufflinks caught the fluorescent light like miniature mirrors. He looked up from his computer with the kind of half-smile reserved for people who think they're in charge. Eli stepped forward, laid the letter on the counter, and said in a voice that barely held back years of anger, "This cemetery's been here since 1948. My granddaddy built it with his own hands. You can't just take it." Dillard didn't even look up at first. He clicked something on his computer, sighed, and finally said, "It's not about taking, Mr. Turner. It's about progress. You see, the Urban Expansion Act allows for land reallocation in cases of developmental benefit." He leaned back, folding his manicured hands. You can file a historical preservation claim. Of course, but that can take months. And groundbreaking, he glanced at the calendar on his wall, smiling faintly, starts Monday. Monday. Eli stared at him, the word ringing in his head like a gunshot. 5 days. That was all he had before bulldozers rolled over generations of history. He felt something twist in his gut. Fury, helplessness, heartbreak, all tangled together. He picked up the letter, turned on his heel, and walked out without another word. That night, the old chapel on the hill glowed faintly in the moonlight. Eli unlocked its door, hinges creaking, dust swirling in the air like spirits remembering. The wooden pews were worn but sturdy. The air carried that faint scent of oil and pine, the same smell his grandfather used when polishing the floorboards. He walked the far end, to the small patch of fenced earth where time stood still. There, under a weathered oak tree, lay the first headstone. Sergeant Amos L. Turner, 1919 to 1983. Freedom isn't free. Eli knelt, brushing the moss off the carved letters with his calloused fingers. His voice cracked when he whispered, "They think they can erase you, Grandpa, but not while I'm breathing." For a long moment, he just sat there in silence, until the first tear fell. Then he stood, pulled out his phone, and took a photo of the headstone, then another of the entire cemetery, and another of the letter that threatened to destroy it. That night, Eli went to war, not with guns or grenades, but with words. He called the local paper, the Maple Hollow Gazette. The reporter on the other end sighed, said he'd look into it, but Eli could tell he'd already lost interest. He posted on Facebook, attaching the photos, typing out a message that came straight from his heart. "My grandfather built this cemetery so no soldier would ever be forgotten. Now they want to pave over it for a golf course. If you have any decency left, help me stop them." He stayed up past midnight, refreshing the post. A few likes, a few sad emojis, but no volunteers, no outrage. No one wanted to go against the developers. They had lawyers, money, power. Eli had memories. By the next afternoon, he was running out of hope until his phone rang. The caller ID read, Miss Thelma Patterson. She was 92 years old, and everyone in town knew her. She'd taught 3 generations of children, led the church choir, and was sharper at her age than most folks half her years. "Eli Turner," she said the moment he answered. Her voice carried that southern mix of warmth and authority. "Boy, you forget who your granddaddy was?" He blinked, sitting up straighter. "No, ma'am." "Then stop acting like it," she said. "That man trained half the boys in this town before they shipped off to Korea. My husband was one of them. You fight, we'll fight with you." Eli didn't speak for a second. His throat tightened. "You mean that, Miss Thelma?" "Child," she said, "I still got his old army coat in my closet. And if they want to bring bulldozers, they're going to have to drive them through me first." That night, Miss Thelma called her church group. The church group called the Veterans Association. The veterans called their grandkids. And somewhere between dusk and dawn, a spark of resistance began to spread through Maple Hollow. Because when one man stood up for the dead, the living started to remember who they were, too. Monday came, gray and heavy, the kind of morning that felt like the world was holding its breath. The sun barely pushed through the clouds as the first bulldozer crawled up the dirt road toward the hill. The machines looked like beasts of steel and greed, their engines growling as if eager to devour what was sacred. Eli Turner stood at the old wrought iron gate of the cemetery, boots planted firm in the red Georgia clay. In his hand, he held a weathered photograph of his grandfather, Sergeant Amos Turner, in uniform. The corners were creased, faded from years of being tucked in his wallet. That photo wasn't just a memory. It was a promise. He'd spent the night before walking through each row of graves, brushing leaves off the stones, setting small American flags in the dirt. Now, the morning wind tugged at those flags, their red, white, and blue fluttering defiantly, like silent soldiers standing watch. A black SUV pulled up behind the bulldozers. Out stepped a man in sunglasses, clipboard in hand. The site manager, corporate confidence in every step. He looked at Eli with a smirk. "Sir, you're trespassing," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "This property now belongs to Harbor Ridge Development. You need to vacate the premises immediately." Eli didn't move. His voice was calm but steady, each word landing like a hammer on stone. "No, this land's been Turner ground since 1948. My grandfather's buried here. So are his men. You'll have to drive through me before you touch an inch of it." The manager tilted his head, unimpressed. "Get him out of here," he said to his crew. Two workers hesitated, young men with hard hats and nervous eyes. They didn't want this fight. They didn't want to be the villains in someone else's story. But they stepped forward anyway. And then a sound, distant at first, the crunch of tires on gravel. A car appeared on the hilltop. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the dirt road was jammed. Pickup trucks, beat-up sedans. Even a school bus rolling slow through the dust. Doors opened. People stepped out. Eli turned, and his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just neighbors. It was the whole damn town. Men, women, and children, young and old, walking toward the cemetery gate. Some carried folded flags. Others held framed photos of fathers and grandfathers who'd served. And then Eli saw it, the uniforms. Army green. Some crisp and new. Some faded and patched. Decades old. Each one bore the same insignia. 118th Infantry. Turner Unit. His grandfather's unit. Tears welled in Eli's eyes as he saw Miss Thelma, 92 years old, stepping carefully out of her car. She wore her late husband's jacket, its sleeves rolled up to fit her frail arms. She planted her cane in the dirt like a flagpole, raised her chin, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Over my dead body." The crowd murmured, then grew, a rising wave of voices. "You touch them graves," Thelma said, "and you'll be bulldozing through the whole town of Maple Hollow." Someone clapped. Then another. Soon the whole crowd was chanting. Not shouting, but singing the old Army of Amos Turner's unit used to march to. The bulldozer engines quieted. The foreman froze. Even the manager lowered his clipboard, unsure. Phones came out. Live streams began. Within an hour, local reporters were on the scene. Cameras rolling, microphones pointed toward the crowd. By noon, it was trending online. Small Georgia town rises to protect forgotten cemetery. A news chopper circled overhead. Veterans from neighboring counties started to arrive, some in wheelchairs, some wearing medals. Eli stood in silence as the crowd swelled. For the first time in years, the Turner Cemetery was alive again, not with mourning, but with meaning. The land wasn't just sacred. It was defended. He looked toward the gravestone of his grandfather and whispered, voice trembling, "You see this, Grandpa? You taught them well." By the time county officials arrived that afternoon, there was no relocation to discuss. The people of Maple Hollow had drawn their line in the dirt, and they weren't moving. And for the first time in a long time, history didn't just rest beneath the soil, it stood tall upon it. By noon, the quiet country road that led to Turner Cemetery looked like a scene from a movie. News vans lined the shoulders. Drones buzzed overhead. The town of Maple Hollow, once forgotten, had become the center of America's attention. And then a black county SUV pulled up. The door opened, and out stepped Mr. Dillard, the county zoning director, the same man who'd smirked behind his desk days earlier. But today, there was no smirk. His tie was loose, his face pale under the Georgia sun. He looked rattled, though he tried not to show it. He adjusted his jacket, forced a smile, and lifted a megaphone. "All right, folks," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "Let's calm down. This is private development property, and—" Eli stepped forward, boots covered in dust, letters still clutched in one hand, a folded copy of a legal document in the other. His voice was steady, clear, carried by the kind of conviction you can't fake. "This land," Eli said, raising the paper high, "is protected under the Heritage Veterans Preservation Act, Section 12C. The crowd hushed. Eli continued, "Burial sites of decorated servicemen and women are not subject to relocation, development, or destruction, not without federal approval and consent of surviving family." He looked directly at Dillard. And as you can see, I'm the surviving family. The words hung in the air, powerful, undeniable. A murmur spread through the crowd. Reporters turned their cameras toward Dillard, microphones extending like spears. "Mr. Dillard, did the county approve desecrating a veteran cemetery?" One shouted. "Were you aware of this law?" Another demanded. "Did Harbor Ridge falsify zoning permits?" Dillard's composure cracked. He blinked rapidly, stammering, I wasn't made aware. This must be a misunderstanding." Behind him, the Harbor Ridge developers exchanged glances. Their lawyer whispered something, and within moments, they started backing toward their trucks. Quietly, carefully, as if retreating from a battlefield they never expected to lose. The bulldozers went silent, one by one. The air that once vibrated with steel and engines now hummed with something else, justice. Eli took a deep breath. For the first time in days, the tightness in his chest eased. He looked toward the rows of headstones, sunlight breaking through the clouds and washing over them like a benediction. He whispered, barely audible, "We did it, Grandpa." Then he turned back to Dillard. "My grandfather fought in France, trained half this town's soldiers, and built this land with his bare hands. You think a few contracts and bulldozers can erase that?" He stepped closer, eyes locked. "You can move dirt, sir, but you can't move history." Thelma raised her cane high again and shouted, "You tell him, baby." The crowd roared, clapping, cheering, chanting Eli's name. Reporters caught it all, the image of a small-town mechanic standing tall before power and profit. That moment, that defiance, became the photograph that would spread across America by sunset. Veteran organizations reposted it. TV anchors told the story that night. And for the first time in years, people remember that courage doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes, it just wears work boots and heart. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Eli stayed behind. He walked the perimeter of the cemetery, tracing the rusted fence his grandfather once built. The flags flapped softly in the afternoon wind. And somewhere, in the space between sunlight and silence, he could almost hear Amos Turner's voice. "You did good, boy. You fought the right fight." Eli smiled faintly, eyes wet. He looked at the sign at the cemetery gate, Turner Memorial Field, and whispered, "Guess we'll be keeping that name." That day, progress didn't pave over history. It protected it. And the legacy of Sergeant Amos Turner and the little town that remembered him would live on for generations. 2 weeks later, the town of Maple Hollow stood still once more, this time not in protest but in pride. After a tense public hearing that packed the town hall to its wooden rafters, the council voted unanimously. Turner Cemetery was officially designated a protected heritage landmark, permanent, untouchable, sacred ground. The crowd erupted in applause that echoed down Main Street. People hugged, cried, cheered. Even the mayor wiped away a tear as she read the final line of the decree aloud. Henceforth, no hand shall disturb the resting souls of Turner Memorial Field. That same day, Harbor Ridge Development quietly withdrew their project plans. Their equipment was gone by sunset. And as for Dillard, the one smug zoning director, the paper simply said he had resigned for personal reasons. No one asked for details. The town had bigger things to celebrate. In the weeks that followed, Eli returned to the Hill every morning. No fanfare, no speeches, just a man and his mission. He mended the rusted iron fence that had once kept cattle out. He sanded down the old oak chapel doors until they gleamed like they did when his grandfather first built them. He spent evenings under the warm glow of a work lamp, carving new names into a block of black granite. Names of the people who had stood beside him that day. At the top, he etched the words, "For those who fought and for those who stood." By the time Memorial Day rolled around, Maple Hollow looked different. Flags lined the main road. Veterans' wreaths covered porches. And when the sun rose over the cemetery, hundreds of people gathered. They came from every corner of the county. Veterans in uniform, families carrying flowers, children holding small flags. Even those who'd once stayed silent came wearing something new, an old patch, the same faded emblem of the 118th Infantry, Turner Unit, the patch that once belonged to Eli's grandfather, Sergeant Amos Turner. And this time, they didn't wear out of protest. They wore out of pride. Eli sat quietly on the chapel steps, hands resting on his knees, watching as the wind danced through the flags. The sound of laughter mixed with the low hum of prayer. The same town that had almost forgotten its roots had now become its guardian. Miss Thelma was there too, cane in hand, wearing her husband's jacket one more time. She leaned over to Eli and whispered, "He'd be proud, you know." Eli smiled softly. He always knew how to bring people together, he said. He looked up at the sky, where the clouds parted just enough for a beam of light to spill over the graves. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "You did it again, Grandpa. You brought them together." The camera pans out, wide shot of the cemetery, now vibrant and alive. Families standing side by side, flags rippling in the warm wind, the chapel glowing in the golden light of evening, and at the entrance gate, a new plaque gleamed in the sunlight, Turner Memorial Field, where courage never dies. Because in Maple Hollow, they finally understood what Amos Turner always believed, that honor isn't built in stone or steel. It's built in people, in memory, in the courage to stand, even when the world tries to move you. They came with bulldozers and blueprints, ready to pave over the past, to turn a sacred resting place into concrete and commerce. They thought they could erase a man, a memory, a legacy, with paperwork and profit margins. But what they didn't understand was that you can't bury honor. You can't bulldoze bloodlines. You can't silence a name carved in stone and sacrifice, because when the machines came to tear it down, the people rose up to defend it, not with anger, not with violence, but with uniforms, pressed and proud, with history, living, breathing, standing tall, with respect, the kind that generations can feel in their bones. And as they stood there, shoulder to shoulder, beneath the flag his grandfather once raised, it wasn't just a protest. It was a promise. That courage doesn't fade. That legacy doesn't crumble. That memory doesn't die when people choose to remember. That day, the town didn't just save a cemetery. They saved their soul. And somewhere in the quiet rustle of the trees, the spirit of Sergeant Amos Turner stood among them, not beneath the ground, but in every heartbeat that refused to let him be forgotten.